Welcome to the Judy Leigh Allen Mexico-Centered podcast. I am Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. On June 2nd, Mexico will hold its biggest election ever. Voters will select a new president along with 628 congressional seats and thousands of local positions. There is much at stake. To make sense of what's to come on June 2nd and after, our center is closely tracking developments on the ground in Mexico. Today, we're exploring what's happening and what's ahead with Javier Martin Reyes, a researcher and professor at the Universidad Autónoma de México, or UNAM. Javier is also a member of Mexico's National Research System. He has a law degree from UNAM, as well as an ABA in Political Science and International Relations from the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, or CIDE. Javier, what can we expect on June 2nd? Let's imagine that it is already June 2nd at 11 p.m. With all that's been going on, with all the turbulence that is rising in the elections in Mexico, what do you expect to happen? And I want you to specifically address one important issue. Do we expect a lot of violence on that election day? Do we expect a lot of judicial action to annul the results in various polling places throughout the country? What can we expect throughout that day, that particular day, and then that night, and then the next morning? What do you see?
Well, Tony, thank you very much for inviting me. I am really honored to be here. I guess you're addressing the most important question that we will see in the next few weeks. This has been an extremely violent election. We see the numbers in terms of how many threats, even how many murders of candidates, basically of all political parties. We are in a historical high. One of the questions is if that is going to translate in violence during election day and specifically in the polls. If we review the history of federal elections, it is something that doesn't happen a lot, right? It mostly happens on local elections. There have been a lot of municipal elections in Mexico that have been invalidated due to violence that happens in the polls. People that arrive to the polling stations, sometimes with guns that can destroy basically the polling places, that can take the votes. So it's a possibility that could really happen. If everything goes well, the polling stations should be closing at 8 p.m. And after 8 p.m., we're going to have a very long road in order to know the official results of the presidential election. You were saying, and you are absolutely right, that we will have a very important election on June the 2nd. But it's also true that we have a really complicated legal procedure in Mexico in order to have official results. So I guess that after 8 p.m., three things are going to happen. The most important institution in this part of the process is the National Electoral Institute. It's an independent agency. It's not part of the executive branch. It's not part of the government. And it's institution in charge of counting the votes. So after 8 p.m., ordinary citizens will start counting the vote in every polling station. And after that, we will see three different types of results. I know it's perhaps somewhat complicated for our audience to understand why we have so many different results. But of course, it has to do with Mexico's past. We were not a democracy until recently. The first thing that we will have perhaps around midnight, it's a quick count. So what INE, the National Electoral Institute, does is basically takes a very large random sample of polling stations. They basically do a statistical estimation of the percentage of votes that each candidate will have. Historically, this quick count has been extremely precise. So that's going to give us a really close approximation to the actual result if it works well, right? Because violence and other problems related to the organization could have an impact on the timing when the election institute gives these results, or even it could have perhaps a negative impact on the precision of this estimation. The second thing that will happen during the next 24 hours after 8 p.m. is that we have a preliminary results program. And what the INE basically does is registers and scans even the relevant documents in all the polling stations. And those results are progressively updated on our website. So any person in Mexico or around the world could actually see what are the results in the polling stations. That program will end on Monday at 8 p.m. Also, historically, this has given us a very, very precise approximation of the actual results. But in order to have the official results, we will have to wait some time. What the Mexican election law says is that the final counts of the presidential election will start the next Wednesday. The INE has 300 district offices all around the country. And what these offices will do is basically add up all the results of the polling stations. In some cases, we could actually have some recounts. So if the margin between the first place and the second place is less than 1%, we can have a total recount in every one of the 300 districts. And also if there are, some mismatches between the data. So basically around Wednesday and Thursday, we can have the final result by INE. But what is important, Tony, is to say that these results are official, but they are not final, because after that, we would enter to the certification or validation process of the election.
So let me ask you one quick question on that, on election day and the days that follow. Is the INE and the police, local police, state police, and federal forces sufficient? Do they have the sufficient resources and authority to prevent violence on that day, whether it's in Guerrero where organized crime may interfere with election day? Do they have enough resources to ensure that the election runs well and that it's clean, free, and fair?
I guess the answer, Tony, is that no. We have more than 150,000 polling stations all around the country. INE, it's an extremely effective institution for organizing the elections, right? That's perhaps one of the very few institutions in Mexico that actually works well. But the big problem is that if we see violence during the polling stations, it's not that ordinary citizens or that people that work at INE could do a lot to prevent those kind of things. Of course, the police is very important, but in Mexico, historically, we have a very weak federal police, which in Mexico, it's called now the National Guard, which is different from the National Guard in the US, and especially at the state level, state and municipal polices are not really strong. So it's a real concern that if we see systematic and organized attempts to impede the voting to take into effect, I would say that INE by itself, it's definitely not the institution that can help to prevent this.
And I believe that the INE was actually, it underwent a budget cut in recent years. Am I correct? I mean, obviously, the president's preference would have been to eliminate it altogether and get the government to organize the elections. He couldn't do that. But at the end of the day, they do have less resources to organize the election this time, don't they?
They do have a lot less resources compared to the past. So that's a first concern. And the other thing is that last year, we saw a partial but very important renovation in the most important part of INE, which is the General Council. We now have a new president that has been questioned because she seems to be relatively close to the government. And also internally, she has not been able to do very important appointments inside the structure of INE. So perhaps the people who are hearing us have heard, for example, that Mexicans living abroad outside Mexico have been experiencing a lot of problems just to be included on their voters lists. Those are things that regularly didn't happen in the past. I guess those are things that tell us a little bit about how things are going on at INE. And I guess that combination between violence, less resources, and some internal problems can definitely be something to be concerned about.
So if the result is very, very close, let's say less than 5%, maybe 3 or 2% or 1%, one way or the other, Xochitl Gálvez with the opposition coalition, PAN, PRI, and PRD, or with the Sheinbaum coalition, Green Party, PT, and Morena, and the losing coalition decides to impugn the election, what is required for an election to be annulled, to be canceled, and who does it, under what circumstances, and how long does that take? And I ask this because it's happened at the local level. We saw it in Colima State at some point. We've seen it in very local elections. But at a federal election, this would be a lot tougher. What would be required to do that, and who would do it?
I mean, you're absolutely right. If you see the decisions of the Electoral Court, which is the institution in charge of deciding whether or not the presidential election will be valid or invalid, most of the cases in which the elections have been invalidated are at the local level, right? But just let me put an example. In 2006, we had a really close presidential election, right? President Calderon won by less than 1% of the vote share compared to what López Obrador, at that time, he was also a candidate, got. And that election in 2006, Tony, you can remember, there were some irregularities, right? The president at that time, Vicente Fox, which was of the same party of Felipe Calderon, made statements in support of his candidate. That is forbidden in Mexican law at that time, in secondary laws. And after that election, and now that is forbidden in the Constitution. But I would say, Tony, that those irregularities are nothing compared to what we have been seeing during the last months and even the last years. President López Obrador has continuously intervened in the election. We even have rulings of the election court that say that those are violations of the Constitution, and those are final decisions. So we have those irregularities. We also have to wait and see if there are other kinds of irregularities. We were talking about violence, but there have also been a lot of protests relating to the use of public funds in the elections. There have also been a lot of questions of whether or not some candidates are using funds that could have illegal sources, even from organized crime. In Mexico, we also have spending limits. So candidates only spend until a certain amount, and all those things could be considered. Let's just say that the Mexican Constitution has a lot of restrictions. It has nothing to do, for example, with the US Constitution. The Mexican Constitution is the sixth longest in the world. Just Article 41 of the Mexican Constitution that regulates elections is more than 4,000 words long. It's almost as long as some constitutions. The US Constitution, for example, has around 6,000 words. So it's a heavily regulated system. And all those irregularities could actually be considered and should be considered by the court. The thing is that the standard of proof is pretty high. So basically, if one political party or one candidate, the losing party, decides to challenge the results, it has to show that those irregularities were decisive for the result. In other words, they have to show, with the best evidence possible, that without those violations, the result would have been different. Of course, this kind of counterfactual analysis is somewhat complicated. But if you say, if the margin is small, especially if it's less than 5%, the Constitution says that on those cases, when it has to do with the use of illegal money, spending more than it's allowed, then it is presumed that those irregularities are, in fact, decisive for the result. So everything...
But the question is, if the margin is very, very small, let's say less than 1 or 2% in favor of the president's coalition and Sheinbaum's coalition, is the fact that the president has been admonished 70 times, and if there is plenty of evidence that public resources have been used for the election, if it is proven that organized crime intimidated hundreds, perhaps thousands of candidates, many of which have already quit, like in the state of Zacatecas, where 217 candidates stepped down, partly because they were threatened by organized crime. With this kind of mounting evidence, you could say the election is tainted, not this particular polling place, not that particular polling place, but the entire election is tainted because the president has the megaphone, so to speak, the big microphone, and therefore all the polling places are tainted by that. Would that be sufficient? And the second thing is, do you really believe that the Electoral Tribunal, which is supposed to resolve all these different disputes, is sufficiently partial, independent, autonomous to make those decisions?
You are addressing the two parts of the problem. So if we see this only through a legal perspective, I would say that absolutely. If we have an election where the ruling party wins only by 1% of the votes, I think that even with the irregularities that have been happening over the last weeks and months, if those arguments are clearly made on the challenges that the opposition presents in terms of all the jurisprudence of the election court and even what the Constitution and Mexican law says, it's definitely possible to say that this election, the whole election, and not just some specific polling stations, should be invalidated. The second part of your question is it's perhaps the most interesting in terms of the political moment that we are living. We do not have a really reliable election court. This court was appointed in 2016. Now we have 5 members on the higher chamber, which is going to analyze the presidential election. It should have 7 members, but the president's party has refused to appoint the 2 positions that are pending. And to be honest, Tony, these judges in general, of course, there are exceptions, have been basically acting as delegates of the political party that is in power. Before 2018, when the majority in Congress was held by the PRI and the PAN, many of the controversial rulings of the election court were in favor of these 2 political parties. And after 2018, when President López Obrador and Morena won the elections, a majority of these judges basically switched and started to take a lot of controversial decisions in favor of Morena. Right now, there's a narrative, and I think that it's partially correct, that sees that 2 of these judges generally decide the cases impartially. But then we have other 3 members that it's really hard to say that even if the evidence is clear and even if the margin is small, they would be willing to take the decision that is, correct in terms of the Constitution and the law. It is very likely that they wouldn't, even on that kind of a scenario, take the right decision for political reasons, not because there's not enough evidence or good arguments on the table.
Let me ask you one more question, which I think is really important. Obviously, the country is polarized. The polls are all over the place. I think the polls are showing that the race is closing bit by bit. We got a month to go, maybe 35 days or so to go, maybe more like 30 days to go. And certainly the race is getting closer and closer in Mexico City, in Veracruz, in Puebla, in Morelos. And certainly the opposition seems to be well ahead in Yucatan, in Guanajuato, in Jalisco. Clearly, in the major metropolitan areas, the opposition is making important gains. So this is coming close. The election is getting to be more and more uncertain as to the result. I think there is a lot of nervousness in the government, the López Obrador administration, and there's a lot more enthusiasm in the opposition. So there's going to be a kind of a match on June 2nd. What if the election is so close that we cannot figure out who exactly won, or it is so close that the election itself can be impugned? Then you have social mobilization. You got people in the streets. You got the Morena party not recognizing the result if they lose or appear to be losing and mobilize around the country. They obviously have been known to use quite a bit of violence and blocking streets and burning cars and things like that. Obviously, the other side can do the same thing. They can mobilize in various cities, and you get an environment of enormous polarization. What's the expected outcome of such a scenario?
Well, I guess like that's something that concerns a lot of people in Mexico, Tony. I would say that the first thing that we should remember is that President López Obrador and Morena, he's a populist president and he's heading a populist movement. He doesn't really believe in the core values of a constitutional democracy. He has always been playing inside the system, but he doesn't have any faith in the system. Every time he loses in 2006 and 2012, he didn't recognize the results. In the first case, of course, the margin was really small, less than 1%, right? But in the second case, in 2012, it was really clear that Enrique Peña Nieto won the elections. And despite this, López Obrador said there was a fraud. The biggest paradox is that right now, if the election is in danger and if the election could be invalidated, is because of President López Obrador. All the things that he has been doing during the last 5 years put the election at risk. So it would be really hard to imagine a scenario in which, for example, the opposition wins by a small margin, or even if the margin is small independently of who wins and the court says that this election should be invalidated, it would be really hard to see President López Obrador say for the first time, I respect the institutions, I respect the results. He's not a Democrat, he is a populist. And I guess like that would be the most dangerous scenario, because it is very likely that he would not recognize
so let me take another minute, Javier, to ask you an important question that came to mind as you were speaking, and that has to do with a scenario in which the election is declared invalid. Unlikely, but let's just play with the scenario and say, okay, so between June 3rd and the first week of September, the tribunal manages to be somewhat neutral. They find that the election was tainted by organized crime, by government interference, by presidential thumbing of the scale, and so on. What would the scenario be? I mean, there's no precedent in Mexico for an election to be invalidated. So in a minute or so, tell me what you think might happen.
I mean, it would be really complicated because we would have a provisional president in Mexico that must be appointed by Congress. I guess like that's another reason of why this election is important, because we will elect the next president, but also we will elect both houses of Congress. So I would only say two things, Tony. We would need to organize new elections, because if the election is invalidated, then new elections should be organized. And which is important, it's the Constitution explicitly says that if an election is invalidated due to some specific reasons, for example, having to do with campaign finance or the spending limits, then the candidate that won the election could not participate on the next election. So, for example, if Claudia Sheinbaum wins and then the court says there are some irregularities that are specifically established in the Constitution, then a new election would happen and Claudia Sheinbaum could not participate. That would also be the case if Xochitl Gálvez wins by a very small margin. So, as you can see, that would be a scenario in which the uncertainty would be there for a while, right? We were talking about very complicated months in that scenario.
The only thing I conclude here is that President López Obrador has loomed large over Mexico's elections since 2006, and he's likely to do so in 2024, not only because he's been interfering with the electoral process, illegally so, he's been admonished by the electoral authorities, but he's also likely to play a role if the election doesn't go his way. And so 2006, 2012, 2024 will have been very complicated elections, and the only one that seems to have gone his way, 2018, is the one that he would actually declare valid personally and then accept the result of. And that's a challenge for Mexico, because that means that there's this particular historical figure who has played a really important but disturbing role in Mexico's electoral politics, really, since 2006 all the way through 2024. Javier, thank you very much for engaging me in conversation.
The Judy Lay Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions, and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Lay Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the Center, and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager.